Okay, in this second module, what I'd like to do is provide a short presentation of how we measure the macroeconomy with particular attention to GDP, real GDP. And we'll see what we mean by real GDP in just a second. The objectives then of this short video are to better understand what GDP is and its components, distinguish between real and nominal GDP, gross domestic product, and understand how inflation can be measured and how it's used in the definition of real interest rates. To start, a quick definition of GDP. Gross domestic product is the total market value of final goods and services produced in a country for a given year. Now we underscore the word final for final goods and services because we don't include intermediate goods and services. If, for example, we calculated the final value of the bread produced and we added in the value of the flour used in the production of the bread, we would actually be double counting the value of the flour. Because normally when I sell a loaf of bread as a baker, I've included my cost in the price somehow, and the value of that loaf of bread includes the value of the flour already. So we only look at the value of final goods and services produced in a country for a given year when we determine GDP. All the other numbers are already included if they're intermediate. It's also just for a given year. We're going to be measuring GDP from one year to the next to calculate growth, obviously. Now, GDP is determined by a series of actors in our economy. The first actor are domestic households. Households are consumers of final goods and services. They provide labor to businesses that produce goods and services. They pay taxes to government, and they buy goods and services from eventually people that import goods and services. The second critical actor are businesses. They produce goods and services in the economy. They also import and then resell goods from abroad. They sell goods and services abroad to foreign buyers. And obviously they pay wages to employees that deliver services of production. The government is our third actor. Government includes government at all levels, national, local, government levels. And the government also purchases goods and services, such as infrastructure and educational services. And lastly, we have other countries. Other countries are buying and selling goods. They're buying our goods in the form of exports. So we export to other countries, and that increases the quantity of GDP for us. We're producing more and more. But other countries are also selling their goods and services to us, and that means we're producing obviously less. To measure GDP, we're going to use what's called the expenditures approach to measure the value of goods and services produced. So let's see how this is done. On the right here, I've put up a square that represents the domestic producers of final goods and services. Now, these domestic producers will produce goods. These goods will be given to or acquired by households in the form of consumption. Domestic firms in the form of investment in capital resources. They're buying, for example, capital goods, which would be buildings or machines. Government is going to be buying goods and services as well. And other countries are buying our goods and services in the form of exports. So three critical things happen. The producers give consumption goods to households. In exchange, these households provide money in the form of euros to the producers, and we call this consumption. Domestic firms buy, for example, machines from machine producers and pay the price for these goods and services to the producers in the form of investment. So investment refers to capital goods that firms buy, for example, machines and buildings. Government obviously is purchasing, so this is government purchases in the form of government spending. Again, they're buying goods and services. And other countries are buying the exports that domestic producers are making. And we see, very important here, C stands for consumption, I stands for investment, G for government spending, and X for exports. Now, an important point here is that companies often import goods to be sold to domestic buyers. These goods that are imported and then sold were not produced domestically, but they were sold domestically and are reported in the measures of consumption, investment, and government spending. So we need to remove these from our calculation of GDP. So we'll have to subtract off the amount of imports from the total that we've created. So to conclude, gross domestic product is the sum of consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports less imports. And we can combine X minus M into what's called net exports. And obviously, net exports can be negative if we're importing more than we are exporting. Another way to measure GDP is the income approach. This is quite basic. If a company is receiving money for the production and sale of goods and services to households and the government and businesses, that money is then redistributed to the government in the form of excise taxes, to employees and households in the form of income, rental income, if there was a service that the domestic households were providing rent or receiving rents, self-employment, domestic households produce their goods and services, they're entrepreneurs and they pay themselves, etc. The money that a business acquires doesn't sit around. The money is used to pay dividends, profit pays dividends, to pay wages, etc. So if we were to add up all of the income that people receive, it would come to the same amount that is being spent by these actors, but also what's being received by the businesses. Now we can see this in a graph. Here I've provided a graph that presents GDP for France, and these numbers have been acquired from the OECD. And what we see here is that consumption is obviously the largest component of expenditures. We see investment, we see government spending, we see exports on top, and then M we subtract off and it pulls us back down to the red line. And the red line represents the level of GDP for France for that given year, in this case 2008. The level of GDP can also be determined by summing up wages, compensation and benefits, rents, self-employment income, and excise taxes. All of this adds up to the same amount. We're just calculating the same amount a different way. These numbers here can be acquired through the website of the OECD if you would like. Now, an important distinction needs to be made between nominal and real GDP. Imagine, if you will, an economy where production is not increasing but prices double. If prices double, we have a lot of inflation, 100% inflation, but production has not gone up at all. The value of the production, however, also doubles, because if prices go up, production levels stay the same, suddenly the value of that production rises. The revenue that's generated rises. But in reality, in the real world, we're not employing more people, we're not growing the economy anymore, it's just a price effect. So we want to remove the impact of changing prices when we calculate GDP. To do this, economists basically say we're going to fix a base year and use prices of that year to calculate the value of expenditures. So for example, the OECD currently has a base year of 2010. If the real GDP is going up, it's not because prices are going up, because prices remain fixed at their 2010 level. If real GDP is going up, it's because the quantity produced of goods and services is rising. So to make sure that we exclude any price effect from our measure of growth, we'll be measuring growth by the change in real GDP. Here we have an example of growth over time. What do we see? We see that there were times when there was nominal GDP growth was quite high, but real GDP growth was quite low. For example, in 2012. Why is this? Because inflation was high. So the value using current prices is high, but not as high if we just use our base year prices. Another thing to look at in terms of prices is inflation. Well, inflation is the percentage change in a price index. The most often used price index is the consumer price index. What we do is we take a bundle of goods and services, or a basket of goods and services that consumers most often consume, and we look at how the price of that basket of goods and services changes over time. So inflation is a percentage change in this price index. We can also look at the percentage change in what's called the deflator. Now the deflator is a number that we will use to deflate the value of nominal GDP, because it's not the same as real GDP. As I said, we have this price effect in nominal GDP. We want to deflate nominal GDP. We want to get rid of that price impact to get to a real GDP measure. So the deflator is basically nominal GDP divided by real GDP. Or we can get to real GDP by dividing nominal GDP by this deflator. We pull it down. In some cases, this ratio is often multiplied by 100. In some cases, it's not. It depends on the numbers you've got. So the deflator is also an indicator of the price level, like the consumer price index. And so percentage changes in this deflator are also a measure of inflation. And lastly, I want to distinguish between nominal versus real interest rates. The nominal rate is what you pay to lenders or receive from borrowers. It's what you see at the bank, for example, 5% or 6% or 7%. The real rate is what you feel, the value of the interest you've paid or what you've received. And to demonstrate this, let's take just a quick look at a simple choice. You want to loan 1,000 to a friend, or you could use the 1,000 euros you have to buy a computer. And let's assume that inflation is 10%. Let's say you give a one-year loan of 1,000 euros to a friend at an interest rate, a nominal interest rate of 10%, and decide to wait 1 year to buy your computer. Well, at the end of 1 year, you receive back your 1,000 euros that you loaned to a friend, plus that friend pays you 100 euros interest, 10% of 1,000. So you would receive back 1,100 euros. But remember, inflation is 10%. So the price of the computer that you wanted to buy is now 1,100. Prices have risen because of 10% inflation. Have you made an additional gain from this loan? No, because after 1 year, that money that you receive back can still only buy, in real terms, one computer. You've made nothing. You've made no change from 1 year to the next. So in this case, you may want to charge more than 10% to make sure that you're covering the risk, for example, of loaning money out, or you want to make additional revenue from this. So the real interest rate can be defined by the nominal rate, in this case 10%, less the inflation rate, which in this case is also 10%. So the real rate that this person makes in this case is 0. This is how we define the real interest rate. So to do, what I'd like you to do is to take the quiz. If you have 8 out of 10, you can move on to the next section in most cases. If you'd like to review, I've offered you a series of very interesting videos to look at and additional resources to consider. Good luck, and look forward to seeing you in the next module.